Greetings, fellow Empyreans. I am Ashtarothi, and this is the Eve Universe Show. We are jumping into Chapter 6 of Theodicy. So far, this story is about how the Amarians have captured a bunch of Mimitar on the planet of Iana and moved them as slaves to the Demnon mining cluster. In that group was several of the elders, which are these super important yet super secret leaders of the Mimitar Republic, or the Mimitar people. At about the same time, a mysterious group known as the Order, or as the Jovians identified them as the Adheduani, activated a sleeper agent and caused them to self-destruct, sending a signal that triggered the Amar, the Mimitar, and a lone federal intelligence officer named Viola to travel to the Demnon system, or the Demnon location, just as it was entering into an asteroid field to bombard it. The Amarian leader was sent by Mekios Sorum, effectively to his death. The Amarian leader was one of the favored of the Emperor. However, he did not die. He was instead captured by some Jovians who also rescued Viola. And them and the Valkyrs that the Mimitar sent have now entered into the Demnon station and are working their way through the facility in order to try to find the lost elders. Viola is kind of washed out. She's a junkie, hooked up on painkillers. But the Jovians are, a Jovian named Grius is attempting to kind of give her some help, although can't help her with her withdrawals, but protecting her. And also they had captured that Amarian leader, and Viola put a slave collar around his neck. Meanwhile, the Federation is trying to figure out what the heck they want to do about all of this. And one of the senators from the Federation has decided to travel to the Demnon area in order to look into it for himself. Otherwise, there's a lot of bustling about. But let's go ahead and jump into it. If you haven't caught any of it, there is a playlist with all of the different chapters in it laid out. So you can go ahead and jump to that. There should be a link down below and in the cards. But without further ado, let's get into the chapter 6. The violence that scars the history of civilizations is testament to the fact that all men are born slaves to different masters. The Empire's strength flows from the absolute recognition that there is but one true master. Peace will always elude those who deny him. Amarian Ambassador Arturos Fenis. Kali Summit 23-220. Religion is a terminal illness whose symptoms include the loss of common sense, humanity, rational thinking, and in your case, moral decency. Gallente Ambassador Jekis Alaru. Kali Summit 23-220. Derelict Region. Agu Constellation. Hahil System. Unknown dead space location. The Hellwraith decelerated from warp, trailing long streams of plasma that coalesced into crimson spheres of fire as the crippled battleship slowed to a halt. Moments earlier, the Amarian cruise missiles detonated against the unshielded structure below the main bridge, hurling men and equipment across the command center like insects caught in a storm. Karth, stunned and unsure of his surroundings, found himself lying on the floor grating. The moans of wounded and dying crew members brought him back to his senses. The bridge was thick with the acrid-smelling smoke of burning electrical cables and littered with the debris of shattered bulkhead fittings. Karth slowly pulled himself off the deck, ignoring the throbbing pain at the back of his head and the wet sensation along his neck and shoulders. Since the first battle at Demnon, the Hellwraith had survived 5 separate engagements with the Imperial Navy. Hundreds of warships were hunting the Valkyr task force, routing them from deep space locations with relentless fury. Of the 30 Mimitar ships that first entered the High Hills system hours ago, the Hellwraith was all that remained. Engineering, Karth stammered. Coughing erupted from several men as they staggered through the bridge to man their posts again. There was a pause before the static-laced voice responded. Yes, sir? How many men were still outside when we warped? 47, the voice creaked. The warp core generators possibly killed them before we accelerated to FTL speeds. Karth remembered how cruel the decision was to warp, having been forced by the Amarian attack to trade the lives of the men attempting to repair outside for the thousands of crew members still on board. Did they repair the comms array in time? Another pause. No. And the fires? Contain. But many decks are inaccessible now. The engineering officer took a deep, labored breath. The main engines cannot be repaired and had to be taken offline. Attempting to power them back will only destroy the ship. Karth was feeling faint, but resisted the temptation to collapse. What about the warp drives? Operational, but with no armor left to protect the generators. One direct hit. I understand. Thank you, Lieutenant. Admiral, you're bleeding, the navigation officer said, approaching him. Aren't we all? Karth thought. I'll tend to it later. Weapons status. One turret is operational. The rest are damaged or destroyed, the weapons officer answered. Launchers 2 through 4 are online, but we jettisoned ordnance to prevent secondary explosions once the engines caught fire. Sir, that gash on your head is serious, interrupted the navigation officer again. Let the medics have a look. I said I'd tend to it later, Karth snapped, falling to his knees while trying unsuccessfully to support himself against the shattered console. Several men rushed to his aid. The Hellwraith will hold together, the officer said, rushing to Karth's side as the medics entered the bridge. But only if her captain stays in one piece. No comms, no weapons, no engines, no place to run. Keep the ship in hyperspace as much as you can, Karth muttered as his vision started to blur. A window for our escape will present itself sooner or later. They knew as well as I that we would die out here, he thought. The Elders are gone, and so is the Mimitar. He watched as the medics knelt to lift his shoulders off the metal grating. I have what I came here for, Karth thought, before blacking out again. The killer of my son is dead. Nothing else matters. Derelict region. Agu constellation. The Arnir system. Waypoint track to High Hill system. Celestis-class cruiser. CFS Venture. Senator Garrett understood the source of his impassionate desire to confront the Amarians. The reckless act that he was about to commit was fueled by moral outrage, which outweighed all other considerations, including the safety of the Venture's crew. The Amarians would not dare attack a Gallente senator, he reminded himself. The notion was inconceivable, and so his conscience was at ease, knowing that the risks were negligible. He stood impatiently on the bridge, watching the warp tunnel dissipate, while the officers stared nervously at the tactical display. Exactly 50 Imperial Navy warships were in the Arnir system, and by the time the Venture's warp drive shut off, half of them were plainly visible through the forward bridge windows. Several Amarian frigates immediately left their orbit around the High Hill Stargate and turned towards the Venture. They're hailing, navigation officer said, linking to intercom. This is Vice Commodore Armistice Tedis of the Imperial Navy. The High Hill system is quarantined by order of the Holy Emperor. Stop your engines immediately and prepare to be scanned. This is Senator Vale Garrett of the Gallente Federation. I will not stop my engines. You have no jurisdiction over my ship and cannot restrict the passageway of Senator Garrett. If you come within 10 kilometers of this gate, I am authorized to destroy your ship and imprison any survivors. Shut down your engines and prepare to be scanned. The Amarian frigates flew directly behind the Venture. Navigation, Senator Garrett fumed. Set your course to the High Hill Gate. Ahead 2/3. The officer hesitated. Sir, I think that... I said ahead 2/3. Senator Desiru's voice boomed through the intercom. Vale, that's enough. You've taken this stunt too far. It has to stop. Senator Garrett remained defiant. Did you hear what they said? They just threatened us with lethal force. Us! And this after they shoot down an unarmed Federation pilot. We will not back down. And I will not cede to their outrageous demands. Navigation, set your speed to 2/3 of maximum velocity or I'll come over there and do it myself. Vale, this is insane. My ship My command! Senator Garrett interrupted, just as the ship started its acceleration. One by one, the 4 Amarian frigates started to target lock them, and then the rest of the Imperial Navy ships, mostly battleships and cruisers, did the same. Senator Garrett, this is your final warning. Stop your engines and prepare now to be boarded. Boarded? Now you listen to me very, very closely, Senator Garrett growled, watching the range counter on the forward display start to decrease. I am a Gallente Federation senator, and I am here to recover the Federation pilot that your forces shot down over Demnon. That was an unprovoked attack of war, and this is your last chance to salvage the peaceful relationship that exists between our two nations. Now, you will let me pass, and you will assist me in the search for the pilot you attempted to murder in the High Hill system. Every crew member on board of the Venture held their collective breaths, waiting for an eternity to pass before the range counter decreased to the 10-kilometer mark, and then continued onward towards 9 kilometers. The 4 frigates trailing Venture suddenly activated stasis webs, instantly forcing the cruiser to a dead stop and sending the occupants of the bridge crashing forward. A new voice spoke through the intercom. You bear the title of senator? Who is this? Vale screamed, getting back to his feet. Your presence here acknowledges complicity of the Federation government in the murder of Apostle Taj Rukan and his disciples. For that heinous crime, His Holiness Emperor Hadrian condemns you to death. Senator Verrill Garrett's last living act was opening his mouth to object. He, along with 342 crew members of the GFS Venture, died within the next few seconds as the Imperial Navy executed the forged death mandate of Emperor Hadrian. As his corpse was mutilated by the same forces that were tearing the cruiser apart, a tiny device embedded in the late senator's stomach detonated a split second before the Venture's reactor exploded. Viola turned quickly to her left, swearing again that someone or something rushed past her. But there was nothing there except for the cavern walls far across the tarmac. Shivering uncontrollably, she continued to rock back and forth, seated on the ground across from Foss Acrodon, with her arms wrapped around her knees. Then she saw movement again, this time to her right, and shrieked as she caught a fleeting glimpse of her stalker, one of the faceless souls from her dreams. Grius! She screamed between gasps of air. Any more of you invisible freaks walking around here? You are hallucinating, he said, and your withdrawal symptoms are worsening much faster than I anticipated. No, Grius, you're wrong. I swear, something else is down there. It's just the 3 of us, Viola, he answered. The Mimitar pilots are with their ship, and the injured Jovian remains in medical stasis on board my own. The rest are deep inside the complex. The rumbles from far overhead reminded her of thunder, just like in my dream, right before the corpses take me inside. She looked at Foss, and her eyes welled up with tears. The man was still on his knees, slumped forward, barely able to support the weight of his upper body. I feel pity for this monster, she thought. I've tormented him every way I can think of, and in the end, all I feel is remorse. Viola moved closer to him and lowered her voice to a quivering whisper. I can't blame you for what you've done any longer, and I hate myself for that. We can't choose our beginnings, or the experiences that define who we are. Contact! Grius said suddenly. We have just moved past several Amarian guards undetected, and are moving into a series of caves. Our search for the elders will begin there. She reached out for the radio device that would unlock the grave collar around Faust's neck. I put this collar on you, and I regret that I did. And I'll regret that I did for the rest of my life. The device hissed and clicked. Faust wheezed, but still kept his eyes shut. Viola leaned forward and pulled the collar off, casting it aside. I didn't kill those priests, she said, as the shaking worsened and the more ghosts darted across the corner of her eyes. I can't hurt anyone. I just can't. She slumped to the ground, curling up tightly. I forgive you, Foss. For what you've done. For what you are. I forgive you. Foss remained silent, but his breathing heavier than ever. Grius, Viola whispered. Let him go. Take off his bindings and just let him go. The Jovian did not answer. Grius? Viola asked, laboring to turn herself over. Please, just take off his... The sight of Grius startled her. He looked as if he was frozen, and his face was contorted into a ghastly expression that she could not interpret. Then she toggled the switch on her headpiece. "Why'd they stop signaling?" Thrumgar whispered, approaching Vlad quietly. The Amarian guards were chattering near the cavern entrance 200 meters downhill, unaware of the 3 Valkyr rifles aimed at them. The Jovian squad leader had been signaling every few meters to keep Vlad informed as to what to expect ahead, but ever since moving past the guards, the signals had ceased. "I don't know," Vlad answered, shouldering his weapon and producing the headpiece that Grius had given him. "I'm not going to hail them until I have a look." "Roger," Thrumgar answered, settling prone and lining up his own sights with the guards. Vlad removed his helmet and slipped the headpiece on. He felt a slight tingle on his right eye as the device powered on, and again as the imagery superimposed over his view of the guards. Resisting the urge to reach out and touch the picture, Vlad adjusted the dials of the headpiece, unsure of what he was looking at. The images looked like a series of sand dunes as seen from high above, the alternating bands of light and dark ridges that ran parallel to each other. "What do you see?" Thrumgar asked. I'm not sure," Vlad asked, fiddling with the dial some more. "It almost looks like..." His fingers found the zoom controls and panned the image back. "Like what?" The dark ridges that Vlad was looking at gradually formed into the gaunt ribcage of a starving Mimitar child, whose hollow eyes were staring directly at him. "No!" Fiola exhaled in a gasp of horror, shutting her eyes and wishing all her might that this was just another nightmare. But her experience with the cruel reality of war, having seen the images of rampant death and destruction brought throughout her entire career, told her that this was real. As real as the tears rushing down her face. The corpses of dozens, perhaps hundreds of children and elderly Mimitars that had died of disease and starvation were strewn all over the cave. Some of the carcasses were still alive, crawling amongst the foulness and stench to find their own place to die. Grius appeared utterly incapacitated, as if what he was seeing struck something deep inside that he was completely unprepared to deal with. Viola slowly got up to her feet. "Grius," she asked, stumbling towards him. The Jovian opened his mouth and moved his jaw as if to speak, but no sound emerged from his throat. He thought he had all the answers, Viola thought, until he saw this. "Please say something," she said, reaching out with a trembling hand to his petrified face. It took several attempts, but Grius finally managed to heave a single word from his lungs. "Why?" "Slave exists for one purpose, Grius," she said, trying to ignore the whispers of ghosts in her ears. "If they cannot fulfill that purpose, for any reason at all, lack of strength, sickness, anything, then they are disposed of." Grius convulsed through several more attempts to say another word. "Children." Viola pursed her lips, resisting the urge to sob. "Yes," she whispered, "they're too small to help in labor camps, and only healthy Mimitars are permitted to breed outside of them." She remembered hearing that Jovian embryos were grown in fetus tubes, and that the embryos were the closest approximation of divinity in their society. The tubes represented the lifeblood of their race, without which they could not reproduce. To see children intentionally left to die in this state, malnourished and dying, was likely something that the Jovians had never seen in their entire history. "Do you understand now, Grius? Do you see why I want him to open his eyes?" Grius looked over at Faust. "He does not want to face what his soul knows he is partially responsible for." Oh, sorry. Wrong voice. "He does not want to face what his soul knows he is partially responsible for," she continued. "This is what I've spent my entire life trying to make others see for themselves." With a tremor, the Jovian head rolled ominously upward, and Grius stared at the sky for a moment before marching directly towards the glaive collar on the tarmac. "Two of them started moving again," Vlad said, hoping that the tears resting on his eyelids stayed put. Dramus and Thrumgar remained silent. Of all the indecency and outright cruelty that the Mimitar race was subjected to, this was by far the most horrific scene that these men had ever witnessed. Vlad watched as the two Jovian soldiers finally moved away from the cave, carefully sidestepping rotting corpses and moving silently around the masked guards standing outside. But the third Jovian soldier stayed where he was. Grius' hands worked with swift precision, locking the glaive collar into place around Foss's neck and adjusting the dial on the headpiece strapped to his scalp. The Amarian was breathing quickly through his nose, as if to brace himself for the pain he sensed was imminent. "You're going to open your eyes," Grius said, manipulating the control of the radio transmitter. "Whether you want to or not." Faust screamed as all 6 syringes broke the skin on his neck. "The glaive collar has 6 different chemical compounds that can be administered, none of which require an actual injection to apply," Grius said. "But the Amarians still prefer the threat of pain as their primary means of intimidation." Faust started to pray again, at which point Viola heard the syringes withdraw, rotating slightly, and then reinsert into his neck. Droplets of blood formed at the old wounds as another ear-curdling scream echoed throughout the hangar. Grius continued as though nothing happened. "Amarian guards wear these transmitters, which can be set to administer any combination of drugs based on proximity. If a slave gets too close to a guard, then this needle," a syringe withdrew from Faust's neck and reinserted in quick succession 3 times, "will inject a toxin that will kill the wearer of the collar instantly." Viola became very afraid of the animal that had been unleashed in Grius, and her damaged heart started to beat even faster. "The collar is primitive, but effective for its purpose," Grius continued, repeating the gruesome act for each syringe. "For example, this syringe injects a generic anti-infective to help curb the spread of disease within the mines. This one injects a pain control agent to quickly subdue the screams of those who are maimed in accidents or beatings. This one is a truth serum so that no secrets can be kept. And this one is a serum that induces euphoria to make slaves more compliant to their master's wishes." Faust's screams became sobs before he refused to open his eyes. "One syringe remains, Viola. Do you know which one it is?" Shivering uncontrollably and feeling faint, Viola sat behind Faust and started to rock back and forth again. "I'm going to die down here," she thought, "buried in the graveyard of an asylum." "Fear," Grievous said. "The 6th syringe injects an agent that induces fear. When used prior to applying a pain stimulus like a shockwave, this agent also briefly paralyzes the muscles and hypersensitizes nerve endings, making the victim especially vulnerable to and fearful of pain." Viola leaned over towards Faust, who was moaning between quick gasps for air. "Tell me, Faust, where is your god now?" The soothing sound of her voice, coupled with the blasphemy of her words, combined for a diabolical contradiction that seemed sadistically appropriate for the wicked hell of his existence. In truth, he wanted to open his eyes so badly, for, if for no other reason than to gaze at the only beautiful thing left in the remnants of his mortal life. But to do so would condemn him to fail the most important test of his soul. The needles piercings of his neck delivered bolts of lightning across the back of his eyelids, reminding him of the cataclysmic explosions that blossomed beneath the beams of the tachyon surface bombardment. "Thousands of prayers," Faust thought, "and still I cannot escape from the memory of what I have done, of what I was commanded to do. One brutal act of cruelty after the next, delivering and receiving agonized pain to all to demonstrate my eternal devotion to you. Deny a man water for 3 days, and the foulest water will taste like the sweetest elixir. Saturate us with death and destruction, and the mere painless existence becomes the dream of paradise. Is this the paradise that you have for us, Father? Is your grand plan just a sadistic scheme to lower our expectations enough to make the end of life seem like the greatest gift? Is this what I am to worship? Death and suffering? Is it, Father?" Faust cried out, scraping his head across the rock tarmac. "That is the devil talking, tempting me to abandon him. I will not give in. Forgive me, Father, for I know that this will pass." "If you will not open your eyes," the demon's voice said, "then fear will open them for you." "Oh, dear God, no. Don't let him." Faust felt the needle thrust deeply into the back of his neck, pushing hot liquid through his veins. Sheer panic engulfed him, his eyes opened wide with horror. Still faced down in the tarmac, a gruesome image started to materialize on the stone beneath him. Viola watched as Faust writhed against the restraints and threw himself over onto his side, trying desperately to escape the apocalyptic vision projected into his retina. "Look at it, Faust," she said. "God damn it, look at it!" The eyelids were peeled completely back, his mouth locked open in terror beneath the breathing apparatus, gasping for air that his lungs refused to allow him to take in. She could see his limbs trembling, and she could hear the faint garbles coming from his throat. It was the sight of a man breaking, of a man scared out of his mind, of a man faced with the bitter truth that he had hoped to never discover. "No!" he said, his eyes darting back and forth. Two horribly malnourished Minmatar slaves were stacking the corpses of children into a mag rail car as Amarian guards watched, shock whips dangling ready at their side. "There are your sacred paladins," Viola said, "defending the will of God." "No, no, no," Faust said, flipping onto his back. "This is what you've dedicated your life to defending," she said, bursting into sobs as one of the slaves collapsed from exhaustion. The sparks from two sets of shock whips striked against his raw flesh followed. "So look at it, goddamn you! Look and accept the monster that you've become!" "No! No! No!" Faust screamed louder than he had ever before, shaking himself back and forth as though someone were physically attacking him. Viola broke down at the sight, while Grius stood by impassively, his cold, black eyes not showing any trace of pity or remorse. Then Faust uprighted himself, leaned back, and arched his neck to the sky. "I renounce you!" he bellowed. "I renounce you and your wretched kingdom! You are dead to me! Do you hear me? Dead to me!" The collar hissed as Grius approached Faust and removed the device, smashing it into the ground with a terrific force. As it shattered into pieces, Faust started to mutilate his own face, smashing and scraping it against the tarmac's surface. Viola reached over, straining to pull him over onto his back. "What have I done?" he sobbed, repeating the question over and over as blood poured down the jagged cuts and scrapes on his face. "For the love of all things good, what have I done?" "Viola," Grius said suddenly, "switch channels on your iCam." Vlad watched as the imagery moved past several teams of slaves blasting away at the cavern walls with their lasers. Off the main pathway into the labyrinth of half-completed metallic housing structures, stalagmites hung from the rock ceilings in this part of the complex, and unfinished power cable tracks were set into the walls. The Jovians were moving in complete darkness, aided by night vision optical equipment that yielded imagery with better clarity than anything the Valkyrs ever used. The moment slowed suddenly, and the lead Jovian soldier with the camera turned back a few steps. The image panned left onto one of the structures and then stopped. 11 motionless figures was standing inside, but the image did not advance any further. The soldiers produced a UV flashlight and placed the beams on the figure. Vlad realized there were corpses tied up to steel posts. "Shine on their faces and zoom in," he whispered. Vlad's heart sank as he realized the decomposing face of the Nefendar, Starkmanir, and Thucker tribe elders. "That's them," he said. "Can you inspect the bodies?" "Negative," the Jovian soldier replied. "Pull your team out right now." "Say again?" "The entrance of this room is set with trap charges. The Amarians know we are here. If you want to live, move your team back to the hangar immediately." Vlad was about to ask why when the distant howls of slavers, carnivorous canine beasts, trained by the Amarians to watch over Minmatar slaves, turned his blood into ice. "Captain, look!" Dramus said. The two guards downrange from them suddenly crouched and ran inside the cave entrance. "Fall back!" Vlad said, pulling on Thromgar's backpack. "The elders are gone! Back to my ship, ASAP! Move, move, move! Kruger, do your copy!" Vlad could see muscle flashes illuminating the caverns through the iCam as the Jovians fought for their lives against the powerful four-legged predators charging at them from every direction. "Standing by. We're coming back up. Get ready to blow the charges." "Roger." Through the iCam, Vlad saw one of the beasts rip off the arms of the lead Jovian soldier as if it was his own. The last image to filter through was a set of razor-sharp slaver fangs descended onto the camera. "Run!" he shouted, standing up and firing 2 grenades from the rifle launcher downrange into the cave entrance. The 3 Valkyrs turned back up the hill in full sprint, and they heard a muffled thump, thump, followed by the sound of collapsing rock behind them. Distant shouts, gunfire, and the growl of beasts followed. Vlad figured that they had less than a minute before the first pack of slavers made it past the debris and caught up with them. Grius muttered in the Jovian language that sounded like a curse. "What's wrong?" Viola asked. I said betrayed. The Inheduani betrayed us to the Amarians, he answered, moving up the ramp to the closest wraith. And the meteor storm outside will end shortly. Captain Kintreb. Viola recognized the Valkyr captain's voice on the device in Grius' hands. Not now, Grius, he panted. Order your Rifter's crew to board my ship immediately if you want to save them, Grius said, pausing at the wraith's ramp. Omnicron 1, abandon ship and follow Grius, Vlad said. Leave the Rifter now! Abandon ship, yes, sir, the Valkyr pilot answered. Viola looked across the tarmac and saw 2 tiny figures descend from the frigate's ramp. Look out! The voice yelled, followed by the staccato of automatic gunfire. Grius switched channels on the device and started moving upward quickly, speaking tersely in Jovian. Viola could hear 2 other voices in the conversation, presumably those of the 2 wraith pilots. Stay here, Grius said from inside the ship. I'm not leaving. I will return in a few moments. Before she could answer, the ramp suddenly closed, leaving her with Faust. The Imperial Navy Commodore had not spoken in some time. Thrumgar was mowing down slavers with his claw when the first Amarian guards got close enough to return fire accurately. Vlad loaded his last 3 grenades into the rifle launcher. Both of you get ready to move, he shouted as bullets ricocheted across the rock over his head. Vlad got up to one knee and fired the grenades in quick succession, aiming for the cavern's ceiling above the separate spots downrange. As soon as the first one detonated, Dramis and Thrumgar jumped up and ran. Vlad counted only 2 detonations as he turned and ran uphill. The Amarian guards, directly beneath their spot where the dud should have exploded, launched his own spread of grenades. Get down! Vlad shouted, throwing himself face first into the ground as 3 deafening explosions buried him under rocks and debris. Fighting through the ringing of his ears and ignoring the pain in his back and legs, he flipped over and fired several bursts from his rifle back down range. I'm hit! Thrumgar shouted, pouring machine gun fire back at the Amarians. F*** me! I'm hit! Vlad pulled himself off the ground and limped towards the sound of Thrumgar's claw as it continued to thunder away. Momentarily puzzled that he was sitting upright on the ground, Vlad dropped down beside him and helped to return fire. We have to keep moving, he said. I'll cover. You go! I'm not going anywhere, Captain, Thrumgar said, looking downward. Vlad finally noticed that Thrumgar was sitting in a pool of his own blood, and that both of his legs had been severed. More bullets ricocheted overhead as the dying Valkyr dumped all of the grenades from his own belt in front of him. I think they got Dramis too, he muttered, as blood flowed from his mouth, and then he pulled the pin from one of the grenades. Run, Captain! Run like hell! Vlad leapt upward and sprinted as fast as he could, nearly tripping over the shredded remains of Dramis as he did. When he saw Gruger waving at him from the top of the hill, now just 100 meters away, Vlad dived into the ground once again. Thrumgar's claw stopped firing for just a moment, and Vlad thought he could hear the growl of more slavers when the grenades finally detonated. The explosion startled Viola, and the blast doors across the tarmac opened. She could see 3 Valkyrs crouching in the doorway, their rifles spitting out fire. I can't help you until I see them, Faust said suddenly. Viola was starting to feel sharp pains in her chest. What are you talking about? I want to help you, he said, looking into her eyes for the first time. You and the Mimitar's. But I can't unless I make contact with the guards. Another explosion, much louder than the first one, startled both of them. There's nothing I can do, she said. Grius might be able to, but... Viola, listen to me, Faust said. Whatever happens here, I swear on my life I will do everything I can to protect you. I know what must be done now, and I have you to thank for it. Wraith's ramp suddenly descended to the tarmac. Grius stumbled down, collapsing onto the ground, and then quickly picking himself back up. The Jovian was bare-chested, and his skin color had changed from the original pale complexion to a mottled gray that reminded Viola of rotting meat. What the hell happened to you? She asked, just as another explosion rocked the hangar. Viola turned and saw 4 Valkyrs running towards them in the direction of the blast doors. One of them had a noticeable limp. They won't make it, Grius stammered, ignoring Viola's question. And neither will the Rifter pilots. Gunfire erupted as all 6 Mimitar dropped to return fire at the doors. Several packs of bloodthirsty slavers sprinted through the opening. The bolts around Faust's leg and wrist suddenly detached, and Grius grabbed the kneeling Amarian by his uniform and yanked him to his feet, and then he handed Faust back his own Imperial Navy service pistol. Grius! Viola shouted. The ramp of the Wraith retracted, and the engines on both Jovian frigates roared to life. Viola entones, Grias said, taking her by the shoulders and speaking just inches from her face. If what Faust said to you is true, then I will see you again. When that day comes, do not tell me how I met my end. Do you understand? Do not tell me how I met my end. The wraiths lifted off the tarmac and flew into the tunnel, disappearing within seconds. Viola was too stunned to answer. Kill me, Grias said as he turned towards the bewildered Faust. In plain view of the guards. Quickly, do it. Bullets kicked up chunks of tarmac around them, and the screams of the Valkyr soldiers being torn apart by slavers filled the hangar. Before Faust could react, the Jovian grabbed his wrist and thrust the pistol into his own chest. You could save the lives of at least some of them if you act now. Faust squeezed the trigger once, and Grias stumbled backwards as the bullet passed through him. Kill not Trafalu, Faust screamed, as the slavers stopped dead in their track, some of them with chunks of human flesh hanging from their mouths, as they recognized the command from the Amarian masters to heal. Then Faust extended his arm, pointed the pistol directly at Grias' sternum, and fired 6 more times. No! Viola cried as the Jovian fell to the ground dead. A pack of slavers trotted over to his corpse, growling as they sniffed the remains of Grias before snarling at Viola. A group of armed guards approached, and upon recognizing the uniform and rank emblazoned on Faust's sleeve, snapped to attention. You're right, sir. I'm fine, Faust said. Are there any survivors amongst the rebels? One for sure, the guard scoffed, although it doesn't look like that will last for very long. Faust narrowed his eyes at the man. Do you know who I am, Paladin? Yes, sir. Then you will listen to my orders very carefully. Any Minmatar survivors, in addition to the Gallente woman, are to be given the best medical treatment that you have available here. They are my prisoners, to be treated as my personal property, and they must be kept alive at all costs until help arrives. Is that understood? The sight of Faust barking orders to the Amarian guards, coupled with the ferocious slavers sitting obediently at his side, suddenly melted away. Viola was once again surrounded by the faceless souls, but the demons that usually whispered to her were no longer speaking. And that's the end of Chapter 6. I would like to give an extra special thanks to all of my supporters, especially my co-designers, Abyssus, Aikawarazu Chan, Arydanika the Queen, BlackRoseNoble, Dajat Lemmont, Drake, GuldanAgeStories, J. Kuhn, LM1, Malak Starfire, Midnight Space Monkey, Not Just Fun, Seeds Aplenty, Serenolin with No Eyes, Syliana Vel'ash, Nephilim, Grendel, and Zaul Nex, as well as my Immortal tier supporters, Ebo1337 and Rid. Thank you all so much. And in addition to them, I of course want to thank all of you who watch my videos, like them, subscribe to the channel, support it by sharing it around and helping get this information out there. If you want to support the channel, you can do so by joining my Patreon, becoming a member on YouTube, checking out some of the merch that we have, get some swag, whatever. But either way, I thank you just for being here. And until next time, I have been Ashrothi, the voice of New Eden, and I'll see you in space.